The late 1950s were a particularly challenging time for the Lincoln Motor Car division of Ford Motor Company and the relatively newly launched Continental Motor division as well. Neither division sold all that many vehicles in the late 1950s, and in fact, Lincoln was practically put on life support before the 1961 Continental pulled it out from the doldrums and became a stunning sales success in that model year. But in 1958, when the Lincoln lineup as well as the Continental lineup launched, the latter with the Mark III, division sales were, as previously mentioned, very, very poor. In fact, between the 1958 and 1960 model years, sales of the Lincoln and Continental division lineups combined really ranged between 20 and 25,000 units each year. In other words, nothing to write home about. These were, however, rather unique-looking cars, particularly the 1958 model that had very pronounced fender forms and overall scallop sections on the body that got progressively toned down as that body aged in 1959 as well as 1960. Engines under hood also ended up losing power each year after 1958. In 1958, Lincoln's newly introduced 430 cubic inch MEL V8 made 375 horsepower and breathed through a 4-barrel carburetor. It propelled this near 5,000 pound, 131 inch wheelbase vehicle from 0 to 60 in a little over 8 seconds, which is quite a feat for the time. By 1959, however, the compression ratio was lowered on Lincoln's MEL V8, and the horsepower topped out at 350 versus 375. And in 1960, Robert McNamara decreed that 4-barrel carburetors at Ford Motor Company were, let's say, excessive, and the large 430 cubic inch MEL V8 was outfitted with just a paltry 2-barrel carburetor, and it made 315 horsepower. Nonetheless, the 58 to 60 Lincolns, while they're overshadowed by the suicide door Continentals that were launched in 1961, are certainly some very interesting vehicles, and they had a number of interesting features associated with them. Let's talk about what I believe is the strangest feature of the 1958 and 1959 Lincolns that was dropped for the 1960 model year, and that's this HVAC, or heating, ventilation, and air conditioning control that you see pictured here. As you notice, the brochure says this is comfort control heater air conditioner for Lincolns, where the Lincoln and Continental single control heater, defroster, and ventilating system allows quick selective settings for passenger comfort. When Lincoln designed all-weather air conditioning is added to the heating system, it too is operated by the single control, affording simplicity of operation and maximum convenience. Now, think back during this time period, as well as subsequent to this, many different HVAC controls use some form of a slider bar for the temperature, and then another form of a slider bar to select from where the air was coming out, and whether or not you were selecting defrost, heat, or ventilation. It wasn't a slider bar, then it was usually push buttons. But Lincoln had incorporated everything for its HVAC controls into one single control and on one single dial. This is an approach that I don't think has ever been used on another car before or since. Let's talk about this a little bit. You'll notice here that there are 4 quadrants to the ventilation control, and this was a picture for what would be an air conditioning equipped car. That lower left quadrant would simply be vacant on a car that did not have air conditioning. But if you look at the top left quadrant, it says ventilate, left and right together, then left, then right. So you could select what vent you could have open on these vehicles, both the left or the right, and it was a vacuum-operated servo that would then move the vent doors when you selected the appropriate setting. If you continued rotating clockwise, you entered the heater section of the control, where you could turn the control further clockwise, and that would allow more coolant to flow through the heater core, thus allowing the outlet temperature to be raised. One thing I didn't mention about this is that it's not only the mode door and the temperature that was controlled through the single control, but also the blower speed. You would pull out on the round control to select the blower speed you wanted. The more you pulled out, the faster the fan would spin. And there are 3 different fan settings. You would push the button in if you wanted a slower fan speed. So if you wanted super hot heat, you'd rotate this control all the way to the clockwise most position in the heater area, and then you would pull out on the rotating knob a couple notches so that you could engage the high fan. Then if you wanted to engage the defroster, in this case they call it the de-icer because it would allow warm air to hit the windshield, you continue rotating the dial further and a vacuum servo would open the defroster mode door. And again, you can see that the two warmer areas mate up, so if you kept rotating the control clockwise, it would start blocking coolant going into the heater core yet again, so that the outlet air temperature would be reduced. And again, if you continue rotating this control clockwise, you'll find that that controls the air conditioning settings. And you can also change the outlet temperature by rotating clockwise. You can see cooler is at the bottommost point of the air conditioning quadrant. Once you rotate again clockwise through the control, you're back to the ventilation settings. Now let's take a look at a few dashboards where you can see this control in them. This is a 1958 Lincoln, and you can see the HVAC control there at the left side of the dash to the bottom left and right of the fuel gauge. Notice this is a non-air conditioning equipped car, so that bottom left quadrant is simply vacant. The knob to operate the HVAC settings is located beneath that dial. It's blocked here by the steering wheel, but you could have seen it in a previous picture that I showed. And while we're on the topic of strange HVAC-related things associated with these 1958 and 59 Lincolns, and this would also be true for the 1960 Lincolns, take a look at this under hood shot from a 1958 Lincoln. Notice that there are a series of hoses going into the driver and passenger side fenders. What could that be, you ask? Well, these cars actually have two evaporators for the air conditioning system when they are equipped with air conditioning. One is in the driver's side and one is in the passenger side. It's kind of a novel approach and certainly a costly one. And I can tell you from driving these cars that despite the fact that they just have a York 2-piston compressor underhood powering the air conditioning system, they do put out some very, very cold air. And within the cabin, the HVAC makes its way through a number of nooks and crannies into the back seat area through these vents in the backside of the front door panels. Another unique and interesting approach that was employed on these 1958 to 1960 Lincolns. I must apologize, as unfortunately the only photos that I could see that were quite discernible to show this were of a car that was in a junkyard. Oh well, there aren't too many of these 1958 and 59 Lincolns around anymore, but they are wonderful vehicles, and just for reference, they are unibody. They are not the world's longest unibody car that would go to the 1973 Chrysler Imperial, but they certainly are very, very large unibody cars. Hope you enjoyed this feature on one of the strangest controls in automotive history, the HVAC control of the 1958 and 59 Lincolns. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.